Welcome to your second workshop, Caring for the Wounded, Walking with Families and Friends During Times of Separation and Divorce. You are gifted, shall I say, with the presence of our bishop as your moderator for this workshop and three panelists. We have Lorrie Yunace, who leads a ministry called Journey of Hope, a healing program for separated and divorced Catholics. We have Blair Brown, an area contact for Retrouvailles, which is an international program that offers tools needed to rediscover a loving marriage relationship. And Ms. Sandra Pickrell-Baker, a Halifax-based therapist and counselor with a master's degree in family studies and social work. They are excited, I think, to speak with you today.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to this particular workshop. It's unusual compared to the other workshops that have been going on, at least in the sense that, for better or for worse, you have me as a moderator. I'm not sure quite what I'm supposed to be moderating, but we will do our best. And so, in this time, we have an hour, not a lot of time, to deal with a really big issue in our church. And as the description indicated in the material for this assembly, we know that there's a synod coming in October. It's actually going to be the second synod that will deal with the topic of marriage and family life. The first one was the extraordinary synod, and you remember, and maybe many of you or some of you were invited to participate in the consultation. And all of that material was sent to Rome. And based on that material and based on the first gathering, we came up with the working document that the bishops will be looking at next October. They'll be gathered for about a month in Rome to look at all of the questions and to try to deal with all of the expectations. And I guess one of the things that I discovered in consulting our people here is that there are a lot of expectations around this question of marriage and family life. So we will let the bishops get inspired by the Holy Spirit, and we will wait for the fruits of that. One of the other things that I discovered was the fact that marriage and family life is in a great state of need. You all know in your own personal networks marriages that have failed. Perhaps some of you are in those situations yourselves. And so that's a fact. What do we do about it? We can wait for the bishops to tell us what they're recommending to the Holy Father. And I'm hoping that what those recommendations will come forward with will be helpful. But we still have to do stuff. We still have to do what we can for the people that we know, the people that are close to us. And so the point of this panel is caring for the wounded. Now, maybe some people don't like to be called wounded, but the reality is that every one of us is wounded in some way. In fact, if that weren't the case, we wouldn't have a church. Because the church is for the wounded. The church is for the needy. And why do we come? Well, we come in order to receive some help, some consolation, some healing where healing can take place, and the courage that is needed to keep going with the journey. So, without taking up all the time, because I could easily talk, and I don't want to do that, that's the context. What do we do in our parishes? Can we do anything in our parishes? Well, we have 3 people here that have accepted to come and share with us some of the things that are available, some of the things that are being done, so that perhaps all of our parishes can develop some ministry and some caring attitudes that will allow us to help those who need help. And so just by way of introduction, to tell you who they are, what they're about, I'm going to ask Sandra to speak to us. She works, or at least she worships and is part of the parish of St. Catherine's. So tell us a little bit about your work and what you do with people who are in need.
So hi, just to get the echo straight. I have a private practice. I'm based in Sackville. I worship at St. Catherine's Parish on Barris Road. I see couples, I see individuals working through different kinds of trauma or challenges. My research and dissertation is trauma and its impacts on the family system. So trauma, whether that's divorce, whether that's separation, illness, it impacts the whole family system, and further to that, actually the whole community system. And that's my area of interest. That's how I practice, from an understanding of that we are not individuals. We are part of a system of a family and also a system of community. Thank you.
And so Lorrie, Yunace, she comes to us today from the parish of St. Benedict, and she offers some service and ministry to people there. Please tell us about that a little bit.
Thank you. I'm completely honored to be here, first of all. This is something very near and dear to my heart because I am divorced and Catholic, and found my healing through my faith and through my relationship with the Lord. And so I'm involved in a ministry called Journey of Hope, which is a healing program for separated and divorced Catholics that we do out of St. Benedict.
Thank you very much, Lorrie. And I'm going to ask Blair Brown to tell us about his interest and service. And he comes to us from the parish of St. Vincent de Paul.
Thank you, Your Grace. My name is Blair Brown, and I am a husband of 36 years to a wonderful wife, Ella, who said she would be here this afternoon, but she's attending another session. Ella and I were married in 1979, and we are the proud parents of 2 children, a daughter who is 34, and a son, Andrew, who is 28. From a background point of view, I was an RCMP officer and also a head of security for Loblaws, and I worked for 14 years in the marketing division with Labatt Breweries. Most importantly to my introduction of myself is to know who I am not. I am not a professional marriage counselor, nor do I hold any university degree in counseling of any sort. I mentioned that Ella and I are married, and we are the Atlantic coordinators for an international Christian peer ministry called Retrovi. We try to call attention to the fact that we are a peer ministry. The couples and priests who volunteer their time and talents do so because we have experienced challenges in our own relationships. The blessings that we have received in the forms of forgiveness and reconciliation we share so that others can experience a similar renewal in their lives. As the family goes, so goes the world. So we continue to work toward the day when every married couple can experience retrovi to heal their marriages. From a personal point of view, I began by saying I was married for 36 years. I should let you know that for the first 19 years of that marriage, I did not allow God into our relationship. And it was not until 1998 and the last 16 years that with God in our marriage that it has become a more loving, a more faithful, and a more secure relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, one and all. Just listening to your opening words, what stands out is trauma, healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Let God into the relationship. What we're saying here, I think, sounds very strange. At least I think if we were to go stand outside that door, and if we started to talk about those key words, I don't know if anyone would stop. But those are the key words that we as a church have to offer. And those words are captured in our expectations and our hopes for all of us. What is it that's being offered in your parishes right now? As we prepare for this, one of the questions that came to mind and that I wanted to discuss with you from the different perspectives that you're coming from. What are the assumptions that we make in our parishes? And then what are those assumptions as persons when we consider marriage these days? You want to go? Oh yeah, sure, you need the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I'm going to make a comment about what assumptions are made about divorced and separated people that I've experienced in my faith journey, is that there's often an assumption that if someone finds himself in that circumstance, that they've taken the easy way out. And instead of working on their marriage, they chose the path of separation and divorce. And I think that's often an assumption made in our churches. But in fact, I think often, especially as Catholics, even non-practicing Catholics, understand that marriage is sacred and forever when they make their vows. And it's extremely painful when your marriage ends. And it's a deep pain, and I would say that's often worse than a death. And I think there's often assumptions sometimes from people that the easy road was taken.
So I deal with, like I said, couples who are making the decision whether to continue to work on their marriage or leave the marriage. And that's what therapists say why couples enter into therapy, is either to leave or to stay. And so it doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or practicing or not. The end of a relationship is a death. We call it ambiguous loss. When you get married, you have all of these dreams for the hope and the future and what it's going to look like. And when that doesn't happen, you actually have to grieve the loss of that. So it is like the death of something very real, very tangible. And it's not easy. And marriage isn't easy. I've been married for 34 years. And what I talk about is actually being married to 3 different people for 34 years. I married a young man who was a musician, opening his own business, and then I was married to the dad of our daughters. And now I'm married to a man who in his later years is particularly healthy and looking on retirement. So it's this changing relationship through the last 34 years, the grief around many things that happen in married life. The opportunity for growth, the opportunity to turn toward God instead of away from God, to turn toward each other instead of outside of the marriage. It's hard work. It's incredibly hard work to stay in a marriage and it's equally hard to make the decision that I see in my practice to leave a marriage. The tide is in, the tide is out. Does the tide being out have enough remembrance of when the tide was in to make the marriage sustain? Is it in the best interest of both partners to make the marriage stay? Is it in the best interest of the family as a whole, as a community? Those aren't easy questions. And to think that anybody makes that choice cavalierly, I think is wrong. I think it does a disservice to those people who have made that choice.
I believe the biggest assumption that we as parishioners and Catholics in different parishes make is that when we see a young couple get married in a Catholic church, we believe that they know what the sacrament is all about and that they will continue to have God in their relationship. Where in fact, a lot of marriages, much like the other sacraments of baptism and confirmation, are just something that we hand out willy-nilly and don't really make an attempt to find out if there's a true relationship in their marriage with God. And I learned through my experience that a marriage is not between two people, but rather three: you, your wife, and the Lord.
It's interesting on the subject of assumptions, because in our pastoral practices, and so here I am, the bishop, and I'm listening to what you've just said, and your comment is, young people, we assume, know what the hell they're doing. Most of them don't. And yet our practice in dealing with them and trying to prepare them and it's all basically what we've always done. And the assumption is that God is there. Why would God be there when he hasn't been there from the moment of baptism, which was not too sure if it was valid at that point either. So there's an assumption there that I think pastorally, as pastors, as bishop, as priests, maybe we need to take a look at that. The other thing that is striking in what you've just said is the notion that as the journey unfolds, you end up having to be married to 3 different people. That's actually quite an important element, because we're not the same person today that we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I guess I'm connecting with my remark from last night when I looked at myself in the mirror and said I got old, right? I'm having to deal with myself at this point, and my assumptions are wrong about who I am and what I'm able to do at this time. And the assumption, which in some ways, from what I heard from you, the judgment, right? The judgment that people live with and carry the burden of how they're perceived. It's a failure. You don't belong. You should be, you took the easy way out. I like all of you, I have family members that are in this condition. I have a nephew. His marriage lasted 2 years. I think if he had known what getting divorced would have entailed, perhaps he wouldn't have gotten married to begin with. And there are lots of young people who don't want to get married because they're afraid of the consequences. But it's the burden, right? It's the burden. What are some of the concrete examples that you've encountered or that you've had perhaps clients speak to you about that they have experienced as Christians and as Catholics, perhaps, but even just as human beings, when they're trying to struggle with their woundedness? Does that make any sense? Some concrete examples of that. And what do we offer for that by way of response?
Some of the assumptions made is that every family is a traditional family, and that becomes a challenge in a lot of our programs, and because many of our families aren't traditional. Single-parent families, divorced families. So when those assumptions are made, it can be challenging to that individual. So I was fortunate enough to be greeted where people want to know my story instead of assuming things, but sometimes assumptions are made that we're all a traditional home.
So what I've perceived is that when a person perceives them being assumed, assumptions being made about them or their life, like you have your children for 1 week on, 1 week off, well, aren't you lucky? You're only having to parent 1 week. It must be wonderful to have a week off, as opposed to understanding that the week that you don't have that traditional family, you're feeling isolated and alone, and you don't want to go out because you're perceiving everybody judging you for not having your children, for not having your partner. Not even wanting to go to the grocery store because somebody might notice you don't have your wedding ring on. It's isolating. And our perceptions are based in our judgments, which are based in our emotions. And it's being mindful about what are our assumptions, what are our judgments, and realize the origin of those in our own life so that we're less likely to project that onto somebody else. And to be welcoming to people, whatever their story is, to be welcoming, to be interested in what they have to say, what their experience is. I think that's all I have to say.
The greatest thing about being in a peer ministry is the fact that you've been there, that you felt the pain that the people that are coming to you have felt, and you've come through the other end. You've seen hope, and you've come through, you've been forgiven, and you've come through the other end. But when they first come in the door to speak to you, the greatest realization is they feel their pain is their own. It's alone. They don't know, or they don't feel for some reason that somebody else has gone through that pain, and that through their wounds, they can help them heal. And to be a wounded healer is a great thing.
We spent a good part of last night and today talking about community and the importance of community. Well, community, the word, can remain a concept. What is it in practice? How does community get experienced for people who are wounded, for people who are separated and divorced, for people who are trying to make their way? What does that mean? I asked that question because of a remark, I guess you made it, the word isolation. Woundedness, divorce, isolates you. That's the opposite of community. And you're talking about what you're doing, and you're talking about peer ministry, which presumes that you have been there. That's what makes you a peer. So you have to somehow find opportunities for making that kind of experience, that kind of knowledge receivable. Peer ministry, community. What does that look like for someone who's wounded, for someone who's divorced?
Well, a good friend taught me, what would Jesus do? And I guess the number one thing would be to love that person and not judge, and shower them with mercy, and provide them opportunities to build new friendships and new relationships that are healthy. Those would be the way that I would see approaching someone who's in deep pain. And also making a connection for that person with someone who has had a similar pain and has come through the other end. We have the annulment process in our church, and often people are so frightened because they have no idea what that means, where to go. For me, the annulment process was extremely healing. If I could share that with anyone so they know what it's about, so they're not going through that alone. So all those things that Jesus would do is what I think we should do as a church.
Again, the therapeutic term would be normalize. It's normal to feel the way you're feeling. You're allowed to have the feelings that you're having. It's normal. It's not abnormal to feel isolated when you're in pain, to want to hide out, to want to become very cocooned in your own home and barely go to work. It's normal to feel depressed. It's normal to feel like a failure, but it doesn't mean you need to live there. It just means that you need to ask for help. And so, as Lorrie said, to find another person who's gone through the process. If it's not entering into a therapeutic relationship, find a peer relationship that works. Someone who can tell you, I've been there, I made it through, and so can you. That's often the most healing thing that we can do for somebody, is not judge them, meet them where they're at, and allow them to tell their story.
I guess I'm hearing your comments and say, you don't have to be there. You don't have to stay isolated. You don't have to be all by yourself, stuck in your room. All you have to do is ask for help. That's the most difficult thing in the world. How do we ask for help? Or can we turn that around in some way and extend a hand of help when someone doesn't even know how to ask for help? See, I think that's the challenge for our parishes and for our communities. How do we become hands that are extended so that help can be received as opposed to simply offered? Yeah.
Well, Your Grace, unfortunately, and it's a truism, when people are facing crisis in their marriage, the last place they look is the church. For some reason, they would not even think about going to see the priest because they don't go to church. They don't celebrate the Holy Eucharist. They don't go to church. They think, I got to go to a lawyer, or I got to see a psychiatrist, or I got to see a counselor. It's incumbent upon us in our parishes all over in our faith to ensure that when they enter into marriage, that they know they're entering into a community, and that we value their marriage, and that our parishes are prepared to walk the journey with them. We can't wait until they have a troubled marriage. We have to place God into that marriage at the onset, and to keep reinforcing that God is there and works in their lives.
I would add that having such an open conversation about divorce in a Catholic church is a great place to start, because certainly I don't think 20 years ago this would happen. So being able to discuss these issues in our parish is central to people knowing it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to say, my marriage is struggling. It's okay that my marriage just separated. So that, to me, is the number one step that we need to allow such open conversation. And I think that would be a step so people would come forward. And also, for those of us who've come on the other side, that we're willing to talk to people and let them know, look, I am a divorced Catholic, and I survived through the grace of the Lord, and then that I will tell you for sure. Many people come to me in my parish with their issues in their marriage, or if their marriage is breaking up, and So just being open to that discussion, I think, is a huge step.
But I guess you've also somehow managed to let people know that you are in this situation. So like hiding the truth or hiding the fact that you are in this situation has been put out there. And it's because it's been put out there that people can come. So what's happening in our other parishes? Where are the divorced in our parishes who are present? Maybe there's a whole bunch of them that are not there, but are there some that are there? And what are they doing? And how can they become disciples for the journey? Right? One of the things that came to me as you were speaking, or one of you was speaking, is to be able to say, I've been there. Well, you know what a definition of an expert is? An expert is someone who's been there. Not an expert because you know every word in the book. Ex periculum in Latin. Those of you who remember that, periculum has two meanings. One of them is danger. The other one is testing. And an expert is someone who has been through the danger, who has been through the testing, and comes out the other end with some wisdom. But somebody has to know that, as opposed to assuming that everybody that sits in our church is perfect, because there aren't any. If you look around, what we have here is a bunch of sinners. And that's all we've got. So, being able to be identified or to not be afraid to speak about who you are and what you've experienced, I think is an important part of discipleship here. Right? Any comments on the...
Yeah, I think I can remember being a young married woman and looking at this woman who is married and had a number of children and feeling like a failure because I was a young married woman and I was disillusioned about what marriage was going to look like. And it certainly was a very different picture than what I had thought. And this woman, I truly believe, was a mentor in a way that she was very honest with me about there's no such thing as a perfect marriage. Marriage is really hard work. And we make all kinds of assumptions about the people sitting in front of us or beside us or at the grocery store and about their lives and about how happy they must be and how wonderful it would be to them, to be them. We do the same thing with parenting. I had a friend who adopted a child 10 years ago, and she was having a really hard time, and I said, parenting is really difficult. And she said, but nobody tells me that. Everybody told me it was going to be wonderful. I said, no, it's really hard, kind of like marriage, really hard work, all the time. There's moments when you go, oh, thank you, God, that I saw the person that I fell in love with. But most days it's like, oh my gosh, he's chewing his cornflakes like that again? I could rip his face off. So it's that, right? It's the moments that we can hang on to. It's like our prayer life, the moments that remind us, this is why I show up every day, is because one day I have the moment. And marriage is the same way. We show up day after day after day, and we have moments of, thank you, God. It brings me back tomorrow. And I don't think we're honest enough about how difficult marriage is, how difficult raising children is, especially in this world of Facebook, where everybody's got the perfect life and the perfect kids and the perfect job. It's not real. Life is messy and it's difficult, and we need to start being honest about that. I think that's where the welcoming comes from, and the bravery to say, yeah, I'm divorced. Yeah, I went through that pain and that grief. Or, yeah, I've been married for 36 years or 34 years. And you know, some of it was good, but a lot of it was really, really hard. And we survived by the grace of God.
Yeah, go ahead. Give her a hand. That's really important.
I think, too, Your Grace, it's important to know that marriage, God wishes the best for us in all our marriages, but not all marriages are made in heaven. I mean, we don't look at marriage in the same way this day and age that they did when our parents were married. And it's not for us to judge whether marriage is successful or not, because God puts us in those circumstances, and it's how He uses us in those circumstances to help others that's important. So when we look at somebody that's wounded, divorced, separated, and we judge that person, we're not being good Christians. They're in that situation, and if they make the best of that situation to help others, then they're doing God's work.
If what you've just said is correct, we would have to conclude, and I think you are correct, that even for people who are divorced, who have gone through difficulties in their marriages, that it's somehow the reality in which God is to be found. God isn't going to be found outside of that context. It's going to be found in that reality. And God is present in the lives of all of your sons and daughters and friends and neighbors who are divorced. God is there. Our job as disciples and our mission, if we accept it, is to try to bring out that, to somehow surface it by the kinds of things that have been said here, like I've been there, having the courage to say that I've been through it, and not being afraid that you look like a failure. Again, we're all at some level failing. Pope Francis, as all of you know, is a Jesuit. Now, for some people, that's the worst thing in the world to be. But as a Jesuit, he is completely imbued by the spirit of the charism of his order, of St. Ignatius, which is summarized in two phrases. One of them is ad maiorem Dei gloria, for the greater glory of God. And if any of you ever went to Jesuit schools, you put those letters AMDG at the top of your copybooks. Ad maiorem Dei gloria, for the greater glory of God. But the other piece, which summarizes the spirituality of Pope Francis, is to seek and find God in all circumstances. If we could get that stuck up here in our brain, right? To seek and find God in all circumstances. That includes woundedness, that includes divorce, that includes the struggle of trying to figure out what's wrong with my marriage until you discover that what's wrong is that you didn't leave room for God. But then when you find God, something happens. That's what we're trying to do here. And when Pope Francis speaks about mercy, and he tells us to go out to the peripheries, well, the peripheries are right there in your own home. And God is there. He's not in this building. Thank you, God. He's not in this building, in spite of that thundering, explosion there. Do you get that? This is part of the message that we need to put across, Now, it's almost 2:45 and we only have an hour. Is there anything that each one of you wants to say that you haven't said that you want to say in a phrase? And then I'm going to open it up for some questions and comments from the floor.
Rick and I were blessed in our early years of marriage to work on engaged encounters for a number of years until we adopted our daughters. And what we used to teach about was the idea of betrothal. So rather than being engaged, enter into a betrothment, like in the olden days of the biblical days, when you entered into a prayerful relationship with God and your fiancé to determine, was this really God's plan for your life? Was this really what he's calling you to? So rather than, I really like them, I love them, I can see spending my life with them, ask God. It was a wonderful idea to sit before God and say, is this the person that you want me to spend my life with? Is this the person who I'm going to be able to tolerate the days when I have nothing left to give and he has nothing to give? Are we still going to be able to do it with your grace?
I would like to say that if anyone is suffering deeply from a divorce or a separation, that the Lord knows your pain, and he's the one who can heal you. And please reach to the Lord for healing, and through the sacraments, reconciliation is essential to healing, and of course the Eucharist. That would be my final comment.
I guess the one message that I would want to leave would be that we need to value marriage. And when you value something, that means that you're prepared to give up your time to reach that, to have something that's good. And that means more than just 1 hour a week going to church on Sunday. If you're going to allow God into your marriage, it means being committed in faith and knowing that there's hope at the other end. And for me, that happened in our marriage, and to God, I am truly thankful.
Thank you very much for what you've shared with us. Ask God. Ask God. The Lord knows. The Lord knows where you are, what's in your heart, and it's the Lord who heals. And I'm going to add something for which perhaps somebody is going to find I'm not being very bishopy. God, the Lord knows, he heals, not the annulment process. The annulment process may be necessary, and it becomes a lot easier if it's done with the assistance of the Lord. And value the marriage. Not in the sense that people around us value it. They like it so much they get married over and over again. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the relationship, which is not a relationship between a man and a woman. It's a relationship between a man and a woman and God. Now, you've been sitting there very nicely, like you do most times in church, but this time you get a chance to say something back. Does anyone want to ask a question or make a comment?
Sure.
Go ahead. You're in the front pew. You get a first shot at it.
I happen to be one of those divorced people. I was divorced in 1986. Found myself on my own with 5 small children. The oldest just turned 8, the youngest was 10 months. This didn't come lightly. It was a hard journey. I did everything possible to stay married. The Lord told me it was time to go. The reason for that is because I was in a marriage where there was violence. And I did everything possible, and the violence started to spill onto the children, and they started to act out. So something had to take place. So I found myself on my own with 5 small children. I went to church, lived in a small community at the time. I've been in a number of different churches because I lived a military life. And
one particular church I remember very well. Myself and my 5 children were asked to leave because they were disruptive or too noisy or whatever the case was. And nobody would listen. And then you get to that point where you're afraid to say anything because you're automatically being judged. It's by the grace of God that we survived, and the fact that my kids went to a Catholic school, so we were able to get church through their school. But if there was that dialogue there, or if I knew who to reach out to, or if they just reached that helping hand, they would have discovered that 3 of my children have learning disabilities. And you have 1 of me and 5 of them, and no matter where I put them, there was always going to be trouble. So sometime it might have been just as something as simple as somebody coming to sitting near us or with us. And they wouldn't have to do anything, just sit there and be with us while we come to church. Something so small and so simple can make the biggest difference in the world. But because we were not welcomed, I spent almost 25 years not going to church. And that was very, very difficult. And it's only by God that we made it through it, and some of my kids have a faith. So I think some people are afraid to speak up because they're afraid that that's what's going to happen. They're going to be judged. And then other people don't know who to speak out to. And even though we say we should welcome them, the reality is most of us do not welcome them.
No comment from me. I think what you said speaks for itself. We need to be a welcoming church. If we're not a welcoming church, then we might as well close up shop. Thank you. Someone else?
I have a sister-in-law right now who's going through a separation and divorce, and we had a discussion at our parish about a month ago, just a little coffee discussion on that topic. And she sat with us and cried because she said, I don't feel welcomed here. She said, I spent my life in this church. I'm in a position I don't want to be in, and I have my own guilt. And she said, and I'm afraid, I shouldn't go to Eucharist. That's the center of my faith. So she said, well, where do I go? And, like she said, I feel if I can't go to Eucharist, and I know all the rules and regulations around it, that people are looking at me and saying, oh, there's something going on with her. She's not. Is it a lack of understanding of our faith? Like, how do we reach these people so that they know, even if you're not going to Eucharist because you're not in a state of grace, or how do we reach them and know they're welcome? How many divorced people leave the church and never come back? I'm divorced, I'm not welcome there anymore. What do we?
See, the subject about going to communion is the subject that gets raised every time we have a conversation about separated and divorced. Can they go to communion? But what we've been talking about, and even what you've said in your own remarks, is connected to the words that you first use, where the individual says, I don't feel welcome. See, communion doesn't happen because you receive the consecrated host. Many of us receive the Eucharist. Some of us receive the Eucharist every day, and we're not in communion. And we're not in communion. So, the point is not who can go to communion. The point is, how do we create an environment where communion is experienced, where it makes sense, and where it becomes the lifeblood of the community? In that context, people wouldn't be saying, why is she or is she not going to communion? Because you would know. So in a way, when we get into the discussion about should we not give communion to separated and divorced? We're talking rules, but we're not getting engaged in the real substantial discussion which has to do with being in communion. One of the guys this morning, one of our guests from the States, said that the model of church, the blueprint for church today, is the Acts of the Apostles. They knew one another. They cared for one another. Now, we say those words, but in reality, we're experiencing the opposite. But when someone says and speaks the truth, I think communion has a possibility that goes beyond the ritual. That's what I'm hoping we can provide in these coming months. If we can only change the face of our church to be a church of welcome, a church of compassion, a church of understanding. The technical stuff, that could get dealt with. And it probably gets dealt with a lot faster and easier when you have that other disposition. Okay.
Thanks. I find that, I see on my own life, part of being separated or divorced seems to fall in a situation where trust is lost because of unfaithfulness or because of different things happening. And I guess what I look for in a parish or in a faith-filled community is a community that will somehow, I guess, reach out to welcome me back. Like part of the discussion I heard this afternoon was we survived marriage. And that kind of sounds a little negative to me. Do you survive or do you live? And maybe the two kind of go together. But there's something there that I'm looking for, and I guess that's what I hope comes out of some of the transformation in the diocese, is that ability to welcome back somehow and then to begin a healing process.
I'm going to ask one or the other of you to speak to that and maybe even to the other points, because after all, you're the panel.
Oh, well, when you suffer a marriage loss, definitely trust becomes a huge issue. But learning the trust of the Lord, He's the one that you can trust fully. That's what heals you and will bring you forth that you can learn to trust other people and learn the skills to trust people that won't hurt you. But, life is, you will also be hurt in other circumstances, but it's learning that trust first for me, I can say was healing. And then learning to trust faithful relationships in my parish. So those were the steps that I had to take to learn trust again.
Trust is one of those things that, depending on how we grew up, is a really difficult experience, whether to risk, whether to be vulnerable. And the other thing that, in my generation for sure, is what would the neighbors think? So you grow up with this idea of being in a room full of critical parents and worrying about what they're thinking. In reality, the only person that I need to worry about what they're thinking is God and the person that I share my life with. Other than that, I really try hard to just go back into not worry about what other people or how little people think of me, because they're so caught in their own lives that it's really important for me to, as long as I know I'm in right relationship with God and I'm in right relationship with my partner and my faith, that's what's important. The rest of it really just is a distraction. It takes me out of. And for your sister-in-law, I often can't go to communion because I'm a celiac. So sometimes I think about, and then I go, what do I care? Maybe they think I did something wrong. It's okay. Maybe it'll amuse them.
Well, far be it that I would ever want to give the impression to anyone that I survive or I'm surviving in my marriage. Since I've found God in my marriage is thriving. The last 16 years have been the best years of my life. I've gone through a lot of turmoil work-wise and different things, but as far as in my faith or where I'm going on my journey, I know exactly where I'm going. I think last week at the Marian conference, Father Casey said it very well when he said, I've read the book and I know the ending. So if you have faith and you're in your marriage, then it's important. The thing about trust is that trust is earned. And we have a saying in Retrovi that the key to trust is dialogue. And it's very important that in order to earn trust, that we learn to communicate with the people that we want to trust us.
You mentioned peer ministry a lot, how if you've been through divorce or separation, you can do a lot of good for someone else that's going through it. I would say that my marriage is thriving, and it always has been since it began. But God is putting people in my wife and I's path who are on the road to separation or divorce. From what you've said, I can't see how my marriage can do them much good, because it seems that having a good marriage is almost something that isn't a nice thing to be around when you're going through separation and divorce. So how can someone in a thriving marriage help someone who's going through separation or divorce?
Well, it would be simply to love that person would be the best way. And, you know, the scary thing when we look at statistics is 50% of first marriages are ending up divorced, but 75% of second marriages. So we really want to heal people who have suffered from divorce before they go on to a second marriage. So showing them how you've been able to put God in your life and how you've worked through the struggles certainly is helpful for their future.
Something Blair had said about, unfortunately, people don't go to their parish priest. I had a family member who was going through difficulties, and that was the first place. Oh, sorry. You had mentioned that, unfortunately, couples don't go to their parish priest when they're in crisis. I had a family member that was the first place they went to, was their parish priest. And unfortunately, our parish priests aren't equipped with handling that. They don't feel they're experienced. And her answer was, if you're not happy, then leave, because God wants you to be happy. And the reason why they both went to the priest is because they didn't want to go to a therapist, because they wanted a Christian perspective to try to help them get through it instead of the secular world. So they didn't like that answer, and they were still struggling. They went to 3 more priests after that, and they basically all told them the same answer. God wants you to be happy, so if you're not happy together, separate. So I guess my question is, you're saying to go to the priest, but our priests aren't equipped. And I know they have a lot on their plate, but are we going to do something in training to help the priests if the couple does go to them?
I guess that's a question for me. And it has to do with our pastoral practices and how we deal with the subject of marriage and divorce and separation. The fact that you would find 3 or 4 priests who would say that what God wants for you is to be happy, that is a reductionist statement, and I'm not sure why anyone would say that, let alone a priest. But it does speak to the fact that we do need right now a lot more understanding of what is at stake in the subject of marriage, what Christian marriage is all about, and to provide the proper understanding of that. We're assuming, again, to go back to that key word of the earlier discussion, we're assuming that the people that we're speaking to understand one another. And clearly the couple that you're talking about had a very different perception, and the priests had a completely different understanding of what was at stake. There is a need for clarity, there is a need for understanding. But more than anything else, from what we've heard from concrete examples, there's a need to be heard, a need to be welcoming. Time has to be taken in order for some of these things to be heard properly. You don't do this over the phone, and you don't do it with one 20-minute, half-hour appointment between this and that. And for that kind of care, we need to evolve a better pastoral care of marriage and family life. Hopefully, from the Synod, we will get some directives that will allow us all to do a better job of pastorally caring for people on the journey of faith. We're going to, there's all kinds of questions, but we need to bring it to a close because we're 5 after 3. Who was it that had their hand up here? Oh, yes, Gerald, okay.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on what the gentleman said over there in terms of the last 16 years of his marriage. He said that they were the happiest years of his marriage because they had found God. We often ask, what can we do to help? What can we do as a church to help the married couples? Well, it starts, as far as I'm concerned, it starts with marriage preparation. Why don't we make sure that they find God before they say, I do?
And that's a catechetical work. That doesn't happen on a weekend. It requires a lot more attention than a day or so.
I just want to tell you a little story, brothers and sisters. A couple of years ago, I was part of an RCIA team. And on the first evening of the program, we were invited to say a few things about ourselves. And a woman next to me said this. She said, I have been divorced for 30 years. It was the last thing that she could say. And it was a kairos moment for me, and I think for most people in the room, because it spoke to what the bishop has written so much about and has taught us so well last night, to become a people of compassion and mercy. And that was an occasion that really changed my thinking about divorce and separation, and I share it with you.
Thank you very much. One last remark here, and we'll call it a day.
Thanks. I know Lorrie personally, so I'm going to speak about something that her and I have discussed. Lorrie, I'm wondering if you might want to answer this, and other people might as well, but we've talked about, I know, because we know each other personally, that you say that divorce wasn't God's plan for your marriage, that you fully support God's plan for marriage, that that's in line with the church. But now you're in your situation that you're in, and you're trying to raise children in that situation who need witnessing to so that they can believe in God's plan for marriage. And we've discussed that, you and I, many times. So I think that there's a role, it's a twofold role for those of us who are married and have a marriage that has the Lord in it, which is, first of all, our reception of you and our care and compassion of you is going to reflect the church to your children. which is super important because they're going to carry the view of the church to how people react to you. And then secondly, that it's because you don't have a Catholic marriage currently, that it's our job and our role and responsibility to witness to that to your children. So I was wondering if you guys might want to comment on that.
Thank you for that. It is a two-way street, and we'll let the person to whom it's been addressed make the last word.
Thanks, Ronnie. It's so true. I have a teenage boy who's 16 and my daughter is 11, and the only example that they have, other than my parents, who have been married for 46 years, they get to see couples living out their faith fully, and that's the only example that they have of a true Catholic marriage, and I'm so grateful for those relationships in my parish, and that comes again to another answer to your question, like you will be an awesome example to a divorced family of a successful marriage, and that's central. So we're all one big family and working together. So thank you.
Well, obviously the topic would require an assembly all to its own and to itself, and maybe we'll organize one of those during the year of mercy. Maybe we can throw that out and see if we can bring people together so that we can exchange as we have done here this afternoon. One of the last things I want to be able to say before I say thank you is that if any of you want more information or want more conversation about what's being offered, there's some pamphlets, you can take some of this, but even more importantly, just come up and talk to the people that have been our guests here today. And so on behalf of the Archdiocese, on behalf of all of us who are here at this assembly, thank you for sharing with us your experience, your thoughts, and may the Lord bless what we are trying to do, and may we become a compassionate and merciful church. Thank you very much. Voilà.